Welcome to Chess Dog. Today we have a game between world champion Magnus Carlsen and Shakhriyar Mamedyarov, who's rated 2767. This is from the Tata Steel Masters of 2022, the 84th Tata Steel Masters. Magnus Carlsen is rated 2865 in this game. Classical time control. Magnus has the white pieces. Let's jump right in. He begins with d4. Mamedyarov plays knight f6, knight f3, d5, c4, e6, and g3. Carlsen has been playing the Catalan quite a bit recently, fine kettlewing his kingside bishop, placing it on the long diagonal. Pawn takes pawn, bishop to g2, taking advantage of that now more open long diagonal after pawn takes pawn. Bishop to b4, check. Bishop to d2, and a5. So what Mamedyarov, the player of the black pieces, is going to try to do is use these pawns on the queen side to just create a massive attack on the queen side, like just a big clump. He wants to defend them, keep them safe, and just push them right down Magnus's throat. And he will dominate the queen side. Magnus, on the other hand, is going to have to find his counterplay, at least at the beginning, in the center and on the king side. Both sides castle, 3-5, castles, e3, and rook to a6. And this is a part of that queenside buildup from Mamedyarov. He wants to use the rook to defend the pawn at c6 after b5, so black would get this huge clump of pawns. So bishop b4 and rook to a6 are designed to protect those pawns as they advance. Queen to c2, hitting the pawn, b5, a4, and now the move c6 helps keep these pawns a little more stable, and the rook at a6 helps defend that pawn. Knight to c3, putting pressure on b5, rook to b6 defending, and now e4. Magnus has to find his counterplay somewhere, and it's pretty clear that at the moment, black owns the queen side, so he begins this push in the center of the board to create counterplay. Bishop to e7, e5, knight to d5. So in this position, Magnus played pawn takes pawn, but what if he takes the knight on d5? Well, if the queen takes, it's just a blunder, because after knight g5, Magnus would just win the game. He's threatening mate on h7 and capturing the queen. So that would be the end of the game. He'd have to retake with the pawn, say cd5, then bishop takes a5, skewering the rook to the queen. But after b4, bishop takes rook, queen takes. White is up in exchange and is a bit better, but black has, two bishops and a really nice pair of pawns at b4 and c4, so he'd have counterplay. White would still be a bit better. Magnus decides to go ahead and take on b5 first. This does allow an intermezzo of knight to b4, which Mamedyarov did not play this move, but that would complicate things a little bit. After queen e4, pawn takes, then rook takes a5, the knight goes back, knight takes b5, knight c6, and here black has pretty active pieces and a lot of control of these central light squares and would be in decent shape here. But instead, he just went ahead and took the pawn on b5. Then after knight takes d5, pawn takes, Carlsen is able to play bishop to a5, winning some material, again, by skewering the rook to the queen. I guess it's a pin, not a skewer. After knight c6, bishop takes, queen takes. Okay, so we can assess this position. Black is down in exchange, but he does have still powerful queenside pawns and the two bishops. White's better, but the job of winning is not easy here. Black has a lot of counterplay that white has to worry about. So Magnus begins by playing rook to a8, activating the rook. And here, black plays h6, moving away from any back rank mating threats, keeping a knight out of g5. The better move was probably to just play bishop to e6. After the exchange of rooks, two bishops plus these pawns gives black enough counterplay maybe to stay in the game. After h6, however, Magnus goes ahead and doubles rooks on the a file, and Mamedyarov goes ahead and plays bishop to e6 anyway. b4 here is a playable move. He cannot take the pawn at d4, by the way. It looks like that pawn is hanging. But after knight d4, queen d4, rook to d1, queen takes e5, rook takes d5. And white has far too much activity. His rooks are on open lines, and he's just in great shape. After, say, a queen e1 check, bishop to f1, black has to deal with white threatening to take on b5. White's just much better here. So instead, he plays bishop to e6. Now, black is threatening to take on d4. So queen to d1 was played. If he takes on f8 first after bishop f8, queen d2, b4, black seems to be doing okay here. So he defends d4 immediately. Now b4. And here Carlsen makes a very interesting decision. Tell me what you think about this move. He plays the move b3, which at first seems like a very strange move, even a bad move, because it allows black to play c3 and get a protected passed pawn on the c3 square, very close to the queening square. But as it turns out, this is a really good idea. It does give black the passed protected pawn, but it takes away all of his pawn mobility. And that allows Carlsen to put his pieces where he wants to. He doesn't have to worry about any tactics or complications. Now he's got what he needs, and he's created some weaknesses on these squares. After rook 8 to a6, hitting the queen, queen moves, he plays knight to e1. And the knight can go to c2 and hit the b4 pawn. It can also go to d3 if the conditions are right, which they are very soon. After Mamedyarov plays this move, f6. Trying to undermine white's center, the problem is it's too loosening. And now the bishop on e6 is undefended, and that gives Magnus some real tactical opportunities, and he's able to play knight to d3 immediately and doesn't have to worry about this pawn hanging anymore, because if black takes the pawn, then rook takes e6, knight takes e6, bishop to d5, and after a move like knight f4, he's just going to get that pinned knight and have a decisive material advantage. So he can't take the pawn at d4, so the knight's really well placed at d3. So after pawn takes e5, knight takes e5, knight takes e5, rook e6, and in this position, black is in huge trouble. If he tries to play the knight back to c6, let's say, to protect the bishop at e7, then simply bishop to d5. Threatens a discovered check against the king, but if the king moves away, he'd just lose the knight at c6, so the game would essentially be over in that case. He tries to play c2. He does play c2. He tries to save his position with it. Hits the queen, and is one square away from the queening square. But after queen to e1, Mamedyarov resigned, and Carlsen wins. And the reason is just the pressure down this file is simply too great. A sample line would be knight to d3, which looks like a strong move, hitting the queen and hitting the queening square. But after this brilliant move, bishop d5, the game would quickly be over. He's threatening a discovery against the king on g8. So if Mamedyarov had taken the queen, then rook takes e7, discovered check, king moves, then rook takes c7, grabs the queen, and he places his rook in a position to stop the passed pawn. He's also threatening the knight on e1 with the rook at a1, and he's up decisive material, and that would be it. So Mamedyarov resigned after queen to e1. So a great game for Magnus. He dealt well with Mamedyarov's queenside pressure and was able to generate enough through the center to win a nice game. Thank you for joining us at Chess Dog. See you again soon.